So welcome, Lawrence Abu Hamdan, here at Secession.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's great to be
in your
here.
beautiful exhibition that I saw yesterday with the title Green Coconuts and Other Inadmissible Evidence.
Yes.
Would you maybe like to start with the title, which is quite particular?
Sure. Yeah, the title was perhaps the hardest thing in this show because I'm connecting two bodies of work. I'm connecting work that I've done and I'm more known for, which is about sort of the investigation into sound and acoustic memory. And that work on acoustic memory led me to the body of work that I'm presenting in this room for the otherwise unaccounted and once removed. And the kind of lessons that I had from the kind of way that I'd understood and through kind of really spending time with the way kind of memory worked with sound kind of allowed me to expand what I think it's possible, what memories, what the kind of remit of possibility when it comes to sort of memory. It allowed me to expand outside of the kind of conventional ways in which we would understand how memory works. So I'm really kind of connecting a work on the investigation of sound towards a body of work that's looking much more at the testimony of reincarnated subjects. So green coconuts and other inadmissible evidence refer to it's the way that I wanted to connect the two works. Inadmissible evidence in the sense that both bodies of work really focus on what can't be discussed or presented within of a legal forum. And by virtue of that, what kinds of use we can have of the art space, how we can use the space of contemporary art to manifest and experiment with the conditions for listening to testimony that we would otherwise not really be able to hear, right? Things that would be thrown out of court, things that are too strange and nuanced to be presented in the news. So what kind of language, aesthetic language, can we develop to hear this other kinds of testimony, which I argue is just as lucid as other forms of kind of exacting evidence that a courtroom would solicit. So that's where inadmissible evidence links these two works. Things that would often be thrown out of trial, but still here somehow are treated with the same kind of precision, the same kind of seriousness as testimony. But of course, the claim to them being testimony is more outlandish. It comes from distortions in memory, it comes from reincarnated testimony, speech transmigrating from the dead to the living, or birthmarks being an index of how people died in their past life. And so, yeah, and the green coconuts part comes from the work I'm presenting in the first room, which is after SFX, and that's really a collection of objects. And those collection of objects are derived from the ways in which witnesses have used objects to describe the sounds they've heard. And green coconuts is one of the entries into that inventory of objects. And so it's one of this, what I'm calling a kind of debris of things. These objects become a kind of, there's a kind of trajectory of debris as we move through the exhibition. There's the sort of objects which go from popcorn maker to green coconut to sesame seeds to watermelons to tray racks, and all this strange collection of memories and sounds and stories in the first room. Here in the next work you see it become a collection of unidentified eyebrows and noses and facial features that are floating in the speculative portrait that we can talk about in a minute. Here it's a kind of debris, the collection of birthmarks and blood vessels that produce these kind of shapes and forms and how they index and store life and memories from a past life and testimonies that would otherwise be erased. And in the last room, it's Basil Bishahin's collection of artifacts and material, sometimes almost fetishistic relation to things that a kind of flag that he has, or a uniform that he has, that was in his past life. So these kind of material debris is what connects the works, and the kind of fragmentary nature of how each one of them is composed. And so green coconuts refer to the kind of fragment, the debris, the object that sort of link it, and that is one of many other inadmissible evidences that are presented.
Thank you, because for this already very intense tour. So it's interesting because you have this work, Ear Witness Inventory, and the SFX relates to that, if I'm right?
Yes.
So it's interesting because the objects that are written within the video are not actually shown. So there's a separation between the visual and the auditory level. And well, then you continue in the last room, you do project the actual archival material, which is quite in a classical documentary style. And what I would like to further talk about is the relation of testimony that you mentioned, because there are so many interesting systems and knowledge systems of what testimony is. First of all, there's of course the legal evidence that is admitted into the courts, and there's this expanding international practice now with more and more media being entered into the international courts. And on the other hand, like you said, there's the oral history, which has quite a different non-legal status. So could you go further into these different approaches that you have towards testimony?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think starting with the ear witness inventory is an important thing. I mean, you ask first about the lack of objects, right? There's just text and sound.
Not a lack,
yeah.
Just a separation,
yeah, a separation
between
exactly.
text and image.
So first I would just sort of point to that in a way, and I would say that the ear witness inventory is my sound effects library. It's 96 or so objects now that are derived from the ways in which witnesses describe sounds they heard. And so that comes from court transcripts, but it also comes from my own interviews that I've done. And if we look at one such of those interviews, I think it kind of gets to your point. So when I was asked to do the investigation of Saidnaya prison for Amnesty International, I was asked to do that because the witnesses had a foremost kind of acoustic experience of that prison. They were held in one room for the majority of their sentence. When a guard would come in, they had to face the wall. Everything, when they moved into the space, they had to cover their eyes or they were blindfolded. So a lot of their testimony was ear witness testimony. Also, a lot of the violence they suffered was sound-based as well, or silence, in brutally enforced silence. So sound was very important to understanding both what was happening inside the prison in terms of a kind of testimony, but also as a register of the kind of conditions in which they themselves experienced sound. So on one hand, there's a kind of classic sort of forensic truth production that has to happen, right? And especially for Amnesty, that was important. Working with witnesses to understand how many doors were active in their wing of the cell, for example, right? And from that you work backwards to understand how many people were held inside the prison, right? Because you start to know, okay, how many there, how close they were to certain events, what they heard in relation to executions or these kinds of things. So there's very specific evidence that needed to be drawn. And that, I think, appeals to a kind of category of testimony that we were conventionally kind of primed to understand and experience. But then there was all this other information that was coming out through the same process, through the same kind of searching for the same lock sounds, through the same kinds of almost deterministic or positive sort of relationship to the truth. Other kind of truth emerged. And that, a most sort of chilling example of that was when we were trying to find out how close Samer was to the main door in his cell. It's the main door of Sednaya, because from that we can start to understand how often people were being brought into the prison. If they can hear the main door, we know, okay, that opens, they hear the kind of what was called the welcome party, right? So I'm looking for something that is of the kind of category of truth production that, I've previously described. So I'm playing back the sound of this door, and he says, it's louder, it's louder, it's louder. We get this huge door sound with the reverb set to Notre Dame Cathedral. It sounds literally like a kind of car crash in Notre Dame Cathedral. And he says, oh, that's weird. He says, that's not the sound of the door. That's the exact sound that you played. That sounds exactly like when there were drop packs of bread outside my cell, or bread outside my cell. So all of a sudden, and even at the time, I didn't really have the capacity to hear what he was telling me. It only really occurred to me much later that we're not speaking about the intensity of sound. We're not speaking about that door. We're speaking about hunger. We're speaking about intensity of hunger. And how that, in a way, was one of the most lucid kind of moments of experiencing that I had of that whole prison, right? We can do all that other work and towards another kind of truth production. But I knew that there was no space where we could speak about that car crash in Notre Dame Cathedral and the pack of bread on the ground, and the distance between those two things, right? The impossibility of one sounding like the other was the space that hunger produces, right, in the sensory. And all of a sudden, through that, I kind of had this tiny fraction of a second where I got it. I understood what it was to be there with him, to witness, right? And it wasn't about what he was saying in terms of a kind of witness testimony, in terms of what the output of a claim is, right? You've experienced something, you say what you experienced. It was actually the conditions of experiencing. It was what made the experience possible that was so important, right? So it's not necessarily what they were saying, but it's the condition of sometimes of witnessing itself, of what produced that kind of type of witness. And that logic is the one that stuck with me and allowed me then to sort of do the work on reincarnation. And
may I just add something, because
sure.
I think it's quite interesting in a Derridarian sense, who speaks of testimony and fiction already in the 1990s, and that distortions of the testimony, lack of memory, forgetting due to trauma, that this brings it much closer to the truth, even though there are lags and voids.
Exactly.
And I think your position as like a forensic expert was to decode this. And what you just described is this very intense moment that you realized that starvation and dehydration had brought them into different states of mind and had changed their perception. And kind of how do you think that your auditory mappings were a link to translate it into also what makes it possible as to be introduced as legal evidence in the case of Sednaya? Yeah,
but that's what I'm saying. That could not be legal evidence.
You say it's not possible?
I don't think so, no. That's because what I'm saying is that you can hear hunger. And knowing from personal experience of testifying in trials, personally, and seeing the extremely finite bandwidth at which speech has to operate to be legitimate, right? I know that would never stand. I mean, what I'm asking of somebody to hear, I'm saying that you can hear hunger. And already the sort of understanding of what is happening in a kind of sensorial space is transferred. It's not even that we're hearing sound anymore, right? So there's only one place which accepts abstraction as language, which accepts negative space as language, which accepts the void as language, which accepts all these things, and that is kind of, for better or worse, the space in which I was trained, which is kind of art, music, culture, cultural production, aesthetic practices. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the space which is primed to hear this kind of truth, and yeah.
So where the court lacks to hear that, to be sensitive to it, there you work with the art space and with music.
I think you need to understand that each place, each site has its own mode of truth production, right? And I think we need to work to that. And it's not that one is better than the other, right? Or that, but it's that we need to understand each one having its own protocols for the production of truth. Just as there is in Druze culture too, there is a whole protocol for understanding who and who can't speak to the transmigration of souls. I mean, it's not anybody who can just say, you know what, I was there. There is a protocol, right? There has to be certain
Would you mind giving a small intro for
Sure, I mean, so
imaginary audience?
Yeah, so, in the culture in which I was raised, it's a belief in reincarnation. But it's not just a kind of, what I'm not interested in it is the sort of dogmatic, just the belief in it, because that's the way I was brought up. I'm interested in the protocols, which, in some respects have to do with also violent histories. It's that you only remember your passing if you had a violent passing, that everybody reincarnates, but really the only memory that transmigrate is traumatic ones. That's one condition. The other condition is that you have to have spoken about it before you're 5. That they have to, what they call, what in that culture is called nataq, which is different. In Arabic, natq is actually utterance, but in here it means a specific kind of speech that refer to the first testimonies of the reincarnated subject, people who can speak, the speech that transmigrate from the dead to the living, and that has to happen at some point before the age of 5, and that's what's so the speech is also an expanded sense in this. I mean, natq can also refer to Bas's childhood drawings, for example, that we see in the film. Yes, so I can't remember how I got there, but I'm trying to think. Yes, so it's each place has its own protocols in this context, and what's interesting is sometimes the meeting point and the tensions between those different kind of conventions for producing truth and understanding reality and parsing it, right? And I think that's why in After SFX you have kind of like cinema truth versus legal truth versus kind of other kind of truths that are derived from kind of different states, hunger and whatever we've spoken about, and other kind of memory devices, and in Bas's work, it's about kind of the truth that we normally allow for the production of history, and then all of a sudden we're confronted with a historian who is reincarnated.
Exactly.
And we have to deal with that.
And which does this method that you use, this interview technique, does it have a specific name?
Which one?
The interview technique that you use in Once Removed?
No, it doesn't, but I like the question. It makes me feel like more professional. No, I mean, it's not necessarily that the technique has a name, but let's say every decision I took to make that film, in terms of the scenography, in terms of how we would be positioned together, it was all designed around the sort of trying to sidestep the question of belief. I knew that if my audience were just to ask me if I believe in reincarnation, or if they believed Basil's reincarnation, if it was just a question of belief, that it would not be interesting.
I thought so.
Yeah, that it wouldn't. Not that it would not be interesting. It wouldn't be valuable as a kind of as a testimony.
It's not the point. Yeah.
It's not the point. So but if I were to film him kind of like mid-shot and I'm off camera, just like we're doing now, right? Then you start to understand. You would he's lit from the front, everything like that. You would just constantly be asking yourself, do you believe him? You're in a position of the audience where you're used to asking questions of belief of your witness. So me speaking with him in the shot, knowing that he's speaking to someone who also grew up with reincarnation, in which it's not alien, it's not extraordinary. Us leading us through the images in a way where I wanted it to really focus on practice over belief. I wanted it to be that you say, okay, it doesn't matter whether or not I believe in reincarnation. What is reincarnation doing in this context? And that's also the way I've done with the images, because he's a collector of images and other remnants. And
which kind of images are these?
Yeah, so these are personal photographs of fighters who were in the Lebanese Civil War in 1984. His comrades and the comrades, and he's created a network of kind of people who otherwise have not been able to kind of speak to history in specific ways.
So, and his narrative is that he is an incarnated soldier that fell as a teenager?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so he died when he was 17 in Abu Hamdan as Yusuf al-Jawhari, and he came back as Basil Abi Shaheen, who is a kind of autodidact historian. Who, in the pursuit of unexplainable memories and flashbacks, has kind of, as a byproduct of that, has kind of accumulated a huge archive, not just of his life, but of the lives of many kind of undocumented chapters of that war, but also of the people and everything who fought there, including, of course, children, child soldiers, of which he was and died. So the open questions that I think my generation did not necessarily have before. But what I was getting onto with that is that there is also these kind of competing types of truth production that happen in that work. And what I wanted to do with the kind of scenography, and again, to set the kind of conditions by which we can hear Basil, is that I wanted his images to be very large. And so that, and the way we're moving through the projections in the interview, one is a front projection, one is a rear projection. And the idea with that is that when we're in the rear projection, we're kind of in the image, we're there, right? We're back in 84, we're back there, where he has his memories from. And then when we're in front of the image, we're scrutinizing it in the way that he scrutinizes his images as a historian. So I wanted this kind of subject-object relation to the image. I wanted it to be this sort of like both the object of scrutiny and also the sort of the thing in which we are inside, we're inescapable from. It's part of our kind of experience. So I found that important in order to show the kind of two sides of his work and really show the inseparability of his reincarnation from his research.
Mm-hmm. It seems there's also a visual link of these shadow silhouettes to the reconstruction of Said Naya.
Right.
Was it maybe total coincidence?
Yeah, it's coincidence because I'm not using the shadow there as an anonymizing thing, or it's because you see Basil. I mean, you see his image, you see his face, you see. It's not about hiding him. It's not to do with that. It's to do with really inhabiting images in that way. Yeah.
And now in the room we're sitting in, we are kind of also presented with some pieces of evidence.
Mm-hmm. More debris.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are the newest work in the show. It's from a piece called For the Otherwise Unaccounted. And it is a collection of birthmarks. And it's built off of the research of Dr. Ian Stevenson. He was a medical doctor in the University of Virginia who had this hypothesis that the birthmark is an index of the way people died in their past life. So he went around the world trying to corroborate post-mortem reports, witness accounts, with birthmarks of new incarnations of those people who died in the past. So his field work set to kind of, hypothesize this theory. Again, it's not interesting essentially for me whether or not it's true or not, and what the output of his work, but it's more what does it produce. And what's really interesting is that almost unintentionally to the author, because he's like a white man from Virginia, I don't think he really had much concern for the plight of people who had been under empire, but of course that's predominantly where reincarnation surfaced. And so he goes to these places which would otherwise not have really entered historical production, which had no recourse to law, right? There's a lot of cases in Myanmar and Lebanon or in Turkey of different kinds of territorial annexation, forced religious conversions, colonial occupation, all of these things that produce different kinds of erasure and different kinds of and removed access to the production of history, right? They were superseded by their colonizers and oppressors. And so in looking very kind of like doggedly just for birthmarks, he produced a beautiful anthology of really people who have used birthmark and used reincarnation as a technology for survival, for the survival of minor histories, for the survival against extinction. And so in the birthmark is a kind of testimony is stored for the next generation. And that's what I find so interesting, that it really become a medium for justice in a way, a medium for thinking both the future and the past.
How is this link between the transmigration and the justice? How does it present itself for you? Because
these are stories of injustices that would otherwise not have been documented, that are otherwise not...
So the birthmark becomes the testimony of an non-justified...
It becomes an index to a kind of testimony, yeah. It becomes a kind of storage point. I'm not sure if it's the testimony itself, but the testimony is stored in the birthmark.
It becomes an archive, a sign, something that links to something else.
And sometimes very directly, right? I mean, like a club wound, a gunshot, right? Like real incidents. So it's also a kind of material indexation of what happened to that person. Right? When, for example, British armed Nigerian military came into Biafra, burnt every record, massacres, right? What happened to those people? There's no place for them. Even now, there's the Nigerian who were fighting at that time have total amnesty. So when somebody comes and says this wound, right, this birthmark is a wound from my past life, not my family life, not my uncle, not but somebody else, from the community. So there are ways of building collectivity. There are ways of ensuring that those histories survive.
Exactly, of collective conscience. Also.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you say that, just to wrap it up, this doctor, he did field research in various countries.
Nigeria, Alaska, Thailand, South Asia, Lebanon, Turkey. Where else do we have here? Burma.
And what was his approach? Was it a classic scientific approach? And then how did it end up in the subject of transmigration? That's quite interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's it. He had a scientific methodology, but to quite an unscientific question. But that's what was quite beautiful about it. And I think he even writes that in his acknowledgements in his book. He says at the beginning, he says, I would like to first and foremost acknowledge the dean of my university for allowing me to do this research. And for more than anything being just open to this application of the scientific method outside of its, which is really, it's a beautiful acknowledgement. He's acknowledging his skeptics, but in doing so, sort of appealing to the necessity of experimenting with epistemology, with what can produce knowledge.
And why do you think that the Western art scene, where we are now, is so open and receptive towards these non-normative approaches?
Well, I don't know if it's more receptive, but it's, like I said before, I think I'm trying to test its receptivity in the sense that can we take our education in arts, in the way we've been taught by Cage and Fluxus and the abstract expressionists, to understand that, let's say, a monochrome painting, right, is just as expressive as, right, like a classic scene, a Renaissance scene, right? Like, can we understand our education in abstraction, in negation, in the negative space, in kind of negativism, sorry, not negation, in kind of negativism? Can these be things that we apply to can we take these logics and actually apply them to other kinds of experiences and inadmissible evidence?
Mm-hmm. That makes absolutely sense, thank you. So you are kind of test driving, speaking with everything.
No, I mean, I don't think it's as, that I feel like that makes it sound a bit cynical, but it's really like, I also was so inspired by, let's say, Cage, right? And this whole saying there's no silence, right? So giving language to negative space was very inspirational for me. Being sort of being trained through arts to be kind of hyper aesthetized, right? Like moving through the world and caring about every little aesthetic thing, right? I mean, that's the thing with artists. We're constantly told, no one else will notice that. You only notice it because it's your work, right? The way a cable hangs from a video screen, right? Like every video artist knows that they either want the cable there or they don't want the cable there, and that means something. So what does the kind of excess mean? And if we sort of accept that a cable hanging down from a screen is meaningful, then we have to also understand that there's ways of understanding birthmarks or green coconuts or what Basil is doing. Those also have to be given the same kind of meaning. We have to be open to what else constitute a kind of speech or language.
And this links back to SFX, because the coconut is the special effect, right? Used in the studio to show a decapitation, if I understood it right? Well,
that's it, because previously, people were using watermelons for a lot of head wounds. But now that's become kind of like passé, and ever since Game of Thrones, people have been using green coconuts. Also because, you see how much more coconut water we're drinking in the world. Right? Coconuts started to surface as a kind of cultural artifact. We're drinking it, and so they became more readily available. I think someone in a sound effects studio picked one up and whacked it one day and was like, oh, this is actually better than a watermelon, right? So this, that really speaks to, again, this kind of hyper-aestheticized way of moving through the world that people like sound effects artists have. But also in the story I tell of the green coconuts, it's really about, when we hear a sound like that in a film and when we hear it in real life, what's the tension in that distance? To what extent is now cinema so prevalent in our experience of violence that we associate it and memorize it and understand violence through cinema? And so that's what the work is also touching on, How illusory nature of sound is actually now somehow more real for us than the real experience of sound and the capacity to hear.
So film, our perception of film has overscribed reality somehow, or became a reality in itself?
I think so, yeah, that's what I start to experience. See a lot of negation of sounds when I look through the testimony. A lot of people say it didn't sound like a punch, it didn't sound like this, it didn't. And so I say, what do they mean it didn't? What does that sound like, right? And then they produce their own alternate imaginary sound effects. So in a way, a lot of the testimony negates the way it sounds, which means they negate the way it sounds in film, right? They say it didn't sound like a punch, meaning it doesn't sound like how cinema makes a punch sound.
Exactly.
But they will say it sounded like a cinder block dropping to the ground, or a lighter being thrown to the ground and popping. That is both a kind of that both understand it's a kind of critique of the way cinema renders reality, but it also shows that there's no other way to render reality around sound than the production of sound effects. And even if alternate or imaginary, we're also doing that in our heads. And that comes back to your other question about when I show After SFX in this way, and it's a sound piece with just text. It's a composition of, it's a 6-channel sound composition with just the animated text. And you don't see the objects, you just hear them. And you're never hearing the object that we're speaking about on the screen. So you're kind of, you start to see those objects in your head, or you start to imagine them, you start to produce images. And so that's why I say this is actually a visual work. And when I show the objects and just have the objects and it's silent, they're mute objects, collection of 96 objects, I say that's the sound work. Like that for me is the sound work, because you're looking at an egg or a sesame seed and you're forced to kind of hear that. And then you would hear the story of the sesame seed or read the story of the sesame seed, and then you have to sort of recalibrate what that sesame seed means to your kind of acoustic unconscious in a way. And so the division of the senses is also important in the work, and you'd asked me that question before and I'd forgotten to answer it. So
yeah, but it's nice to come back to it. So you say these kind of everyday objects, they have several layers super inscribed into them, and you end the film with a thesis, with a kind of quite strong statement. Could you talk about that a little? Regarding these objects?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually what I've already said, that I think that the production of sound effects, whether in film or in the way that we imagine sound, let's say we use objects to commit sounds to memory, partially probably because we lack a precise language in describing sound, but let's say that could be one argument. But the idea is that, I've seen so many testimonies which rely on the use of objects to describe the sounds they heard, unassociated objects, eggs,
popcorn,
very strange things. That it made me think that it can't be just. It made me say that it's an unignorable fact. It's an unignorable thing. It was so common that I had to explore it more. And so what I was thinking is that whether we understand the production of sound effects from film or the production of sound effects that we make in our mind, like the thinking of an egg and the storing of the sound through the egg, is that sound effects, the objects, the sound the objects make are inextricable. The objects themselves are inextricable from the way that we can retrieve memory, the way that we solicit memory, and the way the memory is stored.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. And your role is also quite interesting, because you have a music background, and then you started to collaborate with forensic architecture and also completed your PhD at Goldsmiths. How did you develop this forensic sensitivity and expertise on sound, and in which specific cases did you participate?
Yeah, I will try to give a short answer to that. Basically, I was doing my research on a specific kind of accident analysis for asylum seekers that Europe was, a lot of European countries were unscientifically using to deny asylum seekers their right to asylum. So they were saying that they weren't from the place they claimed to be from based on their accent. And I've done a lot of research to do that into the field of forensic linguistics, meeting also the founders of forensic linguistics like Peter French, Diana Eads. And I'd done all this research into this thing, and I started to be called into courtrooms to testify in asylum tribunals to testify when they were using this technique because of the research I'd done. And then later, so that was really testifying as to research. And then as I'd developed the research into what the practice and all these people were in the field of forensic listening, I was working with Eyal to do the research, Eyal Weizmann, forensic architecture, and suddenly we had a case, we had a sound case, and it was just a case like all these people would have worked on, right? It was the shooting of 2 teenage boys in Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces claimed that they were firing rubber bullets, but we wanted to define whether or not it was rubber or in fact live ammunition. So I went back to these people, I interviewed these experts, and I told them, can we do this? Can we work on this? Would you do it? We have a case. They said, you know what? We really only work for the police, for the state. So you say, okay, who's going to do this work then? Why leave the monopoly? I mean, they have such intense and acute strategies of listening, beautiful ways of understanding the world through sound. Why leave that simply to the monopoly of the state and state power? And what happens when state is the one doing the violence? States are the one committing the violence. You know, just exactly as forensic architecture developed. So then I decided to do it, and remarkably, actually, things started emerging that could allow us to tell the distinction between that. And then after that, other cases, I began to work on other cases, in similar cases where of state violence, state actors.
Yeah, so your evidence production really transgresses both methodologically and institutionally the boundaries.
I hope so. That's the idea. And that's what sound is. Sound is a dirty piece of evidence. It's never clean. It's never isolatable. It's never separatable into its fragments. Sound taught me that things always have to exceed their boundaries. You know, sound bleed through walls. It doesn't, you know, so I think it's a sonic imagination that lead you to the necessity to sort of break these sort of methodological frontiers and boundaries and the spaces of that specific forums allow you to inhabit.
Wow, we could go on for a much longer time. It's very interesting.
Thank you so much.
For your insight.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your questions.